In the first 3 months of 2026, the Singapore property market it looked like a total desert.
It really did. I mean, it was completely barren.
Right. Because if you were watching the numbers, barely 2,000 new units sold across the entire first quarter.
Yeah.
Which is just, shockingly low.
Yeah, people were honestly whispering about a complete market freeze. The narrative was just that buyers were exhausted.
Exactly. Supposedly, everyone was just tapped out. But then, and this is what we're looking at today, April hit, and buyers suddenly snapped up 1,548 new developer units in just 30 days.
It's wild. It was a 6-month high, basically overnight.
So, where do all these people come from, and why were they hiding for the first 3 months of the year?
It was a serious whiplash moment for sure, because that 1,548 figure, and by the way, that entirely excludes executive condos, so it's pure private developer sales, that's a 129% increase year on year.
Over double.
Yeah, exactly. It completely shattered that whole demand is evaporated narrative, because the demand was clearly always there, right? It was just sitting on the sidelines, essentially holding its breath for the right triggers.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have a really fascinating mission for today's deep dive. We're looking at a stack of incredibly fresh sources. So the ERA, Singapore Property Research Reports, URA statistics, and Real Estate Market Watch data for May 2026.
Some really juicy data in there this month.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to explore the mechanics behind this sudden April surge, which, as the data shows, was largely driven by two very distinct launches in the outside central region.
Right, the OCR, so your suburban market.
Yeah, the suburbs. Specifically, we're talking about Tengah Garden Residences and Vela Bay.
Two totally different beasts, by the way. And we will also decode the government's immediate countermove to this surge, because they didn't just sit back.
No, they definitely didn't.
They've just injected 2 substantial new land sale sites into the pipeline. So we need to look at how that specific lever is being pulled to engineer future stability.
And most importantly, for you listening, we are going to translate all of this high-level macro data into actual strategy.
Because that's what really matters at the end of the day.
Right. So if you are standing in the middle of this transitioning market right now, maybe you're holding onto an older condo, trying to decide if you should list it, or maybe you've got cash in hand just waiting for the right moment to buy, we're going to break down how this shifting supply pipeline alters your leverage today.
Because I think the biggest takeaway from the spring URA statistics is that buyer psychology hasn't actually changed as much as buyer selectivity has.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Selectivity over psychology?
I mean, when the right product hits the right demographic and crucially at the right final price point, all that hesitation we saw in Q1 just completely vanishes.
Which perfectly brings us to the absolute blockbuster of the April surge.
Right.
I mean, we have to talk about Tengah Garden Residences over in District 24.
Oh, man. The numbers on this one are just staggering.
They really are. Listen to this. Out of 863 total units, 855 sold over the launch weekend.
It's basically unheard of in this climate.
Yeah, that is a 99% take-up rate. They practically cleared out the entire inventory in 48 hours, and they did it at an average of $2,111 per square foot.
It is a remarkable figure. I mean, 99% is basically a clean sweep. And what's fascinating here is that this project found the absolute sweet spot for a highly motivated demographic.
You're talking about the HDB uptrader family.
Exactly. Tengah Garden Residences is the very first major private condo in Tengah. And for some context for those who haven't been out west lately, Tengah is being developed from the ground up.
Right, it's that massive new eco-town.
Yeah, an eco-town with a car-free center positioned right next to the Jurong Innovation District. It's a huge growth node.
Let me throw an analogy at you because I was trying to wrap my head around this 99% sellout. To me, it feels like a highly anticipated family SUV finally hitting the showroom floor.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Because it's not a flashy, low-slung sports car. It's not necessarily turning heads on a runway somewhere. But it has the cup holders. It has the 5-star safety rating, the trunk space. It's just practically bulletproof for the masses.
That is a really, really accurate way to frame it because it just ticks every single functional box for a family looking to establish a long-term footprint in the West.
And the buyer demographics totally back that up, too.
They do. 90% of the buyers were Singaporeans. We are overwhelmingly looking at upgraders coming from surrounding public housing estates. So Jurong West, Choa Chu Kang, Bukit Batok.
Okay, but I need to stop you there for a second because the math feels, frankly, incredibly disconnected from the reality of an average family.
How so?
Well, if these buyers are your quintessential mass market suburban upgraders, people who are supposedly highly price sensitive, How on earth does a suburban condo at $2,111 per square foot represent an affordability sweet spot?
It does sound high.
I mean, a few years ago, $2,000 PSF in the suburbs would have been laughed right out of the sales gallery.
It sounds absurd on the surface, I completely agree, but you have to separate the per square foot price from the actual check the buyer is writing.
The total quantum.
Yes, what we call the overall quantum. Developers are acutely aware of the hard limits on bank loans, right?
Mm.
The TDSR and all that. So to keep that final price tag below the ceiling of what these families can legally borrow, they are systematically engineering smaller, highly efficient layouts.
Oh, I see. So you're essentially paying a premium per square foot, but you are buying fewer square feet to keep the total bill down.
Precisely. They are stripping out any dead space, long corridors, gone.
Right.
Balconies are minimized. Every square inch is optimized so that a three-bedroom unit today might be noticeably more compact than a three-bedroom built 10 years ago.
But the final price stays hovering around that S1.8 sex $2 million mark.
Exactly, and that specific quantum, even though the PDF is high, is actually manageable for a cash-rich HDB upgrader.
Let's talk about where that cash is actually coming from, though, because the sources point to a very specific mechanism driving this, which is the MOP wave, the minimum occupation period.
A huge, huge factor right now.
Right, because the rules state you have to live in your subsidized public flat for 5 years before you can sell it on the open market. And right now, we're seeing just a flood of these flats hitting that 5-year mark.
The ERA research notes that between 5,000 and 6,000 flats are reaching their MOP in 2026 alone.
That's a massive influx.
It is. Now, factor in that HDB resale median prices in many of these exact same towns have jumped over 30% since 2020.
Wow, over 30%. So these homeowners are sitting on a gold mine of unexpected equity.
Basically, yes.
They bought a subsidized flat, the broader market went on a historic run during the pandemic, and now they're cashing out.
They sell the public flat, they unlock a huge pile of cash, and they channel that directly into the down payment for a project like Tengah Garden.
Which completely bypasses the need for,
Right.
exorbitant monthly salaries.
Exactly, because the initial equity hurdle is entirely funded by the public housing market's growth. It creates a highly predictable, incredibly deep pool of demand.
Okay, that makes total sense. That completely explains the 99% sellout for our practical family SUV. But the OCR, the suburban market, isn't just families anymore, is it?
Not at all.
Because the other major launch in April tells a completely divergent story. It really looks like the suburban market is essentially splitting into two distinct lanes.
Yeah, we are seeing a definitive two-speed OCR market emerge. You have the mass market volume of Tengah on one side, and then on the other, you have the premium outlier, Vela Bay.
Right, Vela Bay. This is over in District 16, right along Bayshore Road in the east.
A very different vibe from Tengah.
Very. So they launched 515 units, and 370 of them moved on launch day. That's a 72% take-up rate.
Which is a very solid number for a launch day.
Oh, absolutely solid.
Yeah.
But the jaw dropper here is the price tag. The average was $2,865 per square foot.
Yeah, that is a massive number.
$2,865. That establishes a completely new benchmark for the East Coast corridor.
And just to contextualize that for a second, we are talking about suburban, outside, central region property transacting at levels that used to be strictly reserved for luxury city center condos.
That's mind-blowing.
But the developers here are selling a very different narrative compared to Tengah. Vela Bay is anchored directly to the greater Bayshore transformation.
Walk me through that transformation then. What exactly are these buyers paying for at nearly $2,900 a foot?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. They are basically pricing in the future. The project sits right on top of the upcoming Bayshore MRT station.
So seamless connectivity.
Right. And it's integrated into a brand new East Coast waterfront precinct that the government is developing. The buyer profile here isn't the pragmatic Jurong West upgrader looking for efficiency.
So who is buying these?
These are East Coast loyalists, sophisticated investors, and crucially, buyers who have been priced out of the older, established resale markets nearby, like Marine Parade or Siglap.
Okay, but I'm going to push back on this buyer logic again.
Go for it.
$2,865 per square foot is dangerously close to core central region prices, the CCR. That's your Orchard Road prime city real estate.
It is very close.
So why would a rational buyer pay prime city prices for a suburban neighborhood where this promised waterfront township is still, frankly, largely a construction site.
I get the skepticism, but the reality is that the traditional definitions of prime and suburban are just breaking down. Let's look at the actual data from week 18 of 2026.
Okay.
The price gap between the CCR, the prime city, and the rest of the market has narrowed to just 10%.
Wait, really? Just 10%?
Yes, that is the tightest that margin has been since 1995.
So a suburban condo is only 10% cheaper than a luxury city condo.
On a per square foot basis, yes. So put yourself in the shoes of a premium buyer. You have a fixed budget.
Right.
You can either buy an older, least decaying unit in the city center that might need massive renovation, or maybe a tiny new build in the city with zero lifestyle amenities.
Okay, neither sounds great.
Right. Or you look east. Vela Bay offers a brand new sea-fronting lifestyle, seamless MRT integration right at your doorstep, and a master plan neighborhood. The calculus just shifts from purely geographic prestige to lifestyle integration.
Oh, wow. That perfectly illustrates the two-speed concept you mentioned.
Exactly.
At $2,111 per square foot, Tengah taps into the broad base of the pyramid, right? The deep pool of upgraders, and they sell 99%.
Spot on.
But it's $2,865 per square foot. Vela Bay is tapping into the very top of the pyramid. It's a much shallower pool of premium buyers.
It is shallower, but it is undeniably willing. I mean, moving 72% of a 500-unit project at nearly $2,900 CSF on day one, that proves there is immense liquidity in the market provided the location narrative is strong enough.
But $2,865 per square foot isn't just a number that shocks everyday buyers, right? It sets off alarm bells for policymakers.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because if suburban prices detach entirely from economic fundamentals, the whole system wobbles. So how does the government step in? How do they pull the emergency brake on a runaway market like this?
Well, the thing is, they don't pull an emergency brake. They adjust the throttle.
That's the throttle.
Yeah. In Singapore, the primary mechanism for that is the Government Land Sales Program, or GLS. The government owns the land, and they release it to private developers in a highly calibrated way to shape future supply and influence price discovery.
And right on the heels of these sky-high April numbers, the government literally just announced 2 major new land sale sites.
Which is not a coincidence.
Right.
Okay.
Let's break these down because their locations are incredibly strategic. First, we have Burleigh Drive. This is in the Rest of Central Region, the RCR, basically the city fringe.
Yep.
It's slated for about 415 units near the Labrador Park MRT.
And this site is a crucial piece of the Greater Southern Waterfront transformation, where they're redeveloping all those old industrial ports into prime residential and commercial space.
But why release it right now? The waterfront transformation is a decades-long project. It's massive.
It is, but by releasing the Burleigh Drive site today, the government is proactively dropping an anchor on prices.
Dropping an anchor.
Yeah. They are setting a public benchmark for what living in the Greater Southern Waterfront will cost. It's a highly calculated move to introduce tangible supply into a really hyped zone before speculative frenzy can drive up the prices of existing older properties nearby.
Okay, that makes sense. Established a baseline before the market invents one out of thin air.
Precisely.
But the second site they announced is the real heavyweight, New Upper Tengah Road out in the OCR. The estimates are, what, 1,010 to 1,040 units? Right next to the BDOC MRT station.
Huge.
That is a colossal injection of supply directly into the East Upgrader belt.
And that timing is entirely deliberate. Think about the geography here. You have Vela Bay just down the road setting new price floors at nearly $2,900 PSF. The government looked at that and immediately drops over 1,000 new units into the adjacent BDOC area.
Oh, I see. It's like a high-stakes game of musical chairs.
Yes.
Buyers in the East might be panicking, thinking, oh no, I have to grab a $2,800 PSF unit today before I get priced out entirely. But suddenly, the government announces they are bringing 1,000 new chairs into the room next year.
Exactly. It immediately releases the psychological pressure, and it forces rationality on the developers, too.
How so?
Well, the macro URA data reveals that the confirmed list for government land sales in the first half of 2026 is actually running roughly 50% above the 10-year average.
50% above average.
Yeah. And furthermore, there are currently over 38,133 uncompleted private residential units with planning approval sitting in the pipeline.
Over 38,000 units. That is just a tidal wave of future housing.
It's huge.
But I have to ask, how does adding dirt, basically empty land, now change anything today if it takes developers 3 to 4 years to actually build and deliver those condos?
Yeah.
Like, does the announcement of future land really stop prices from rising right now?
It acts as a medium-term moderating signal. Let's say you are a developer bidding on that new BidOx site today. You are locking in your land costs for a project that won't even launch until 2027 or 2028.
Right.
You know that by the time you go to market, you will be competing against a massive chunk of those 38,000 units that are also being built.
Ah. So you can't just blindly overbid on the land today, assuming you can effortlessly pass the cost on to the buyer later, because the buyer will have way too many other options by then.
Correct. It won't crash prices today because immediate unsold inventory currently in the market is actually still relatively tight.
Which is why Tenga can sell 99% in a single weekend.
Exactly. But this 50% bump in GLS supply guarantees intense competition among developers in the near future. It effectively strips away the speculative premium.
Okay, so we've navigated macro data, we've looked at the two-speed suburban market, and the government's supply-side chess moves. So what does this all mean? If you are listening to this right now, how do you actually play this board?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the overarching theme, which the Propnex CEO actually accurately labeled in the sources, is that we are entering a Goldilocks phase.
A Goldilocks phase, so not too hot, not too cold.
Precisely. Prices are stabilizing and inventory is reaching a healthier equilibrium. We are moving away from the really frantic panic bidding environment of a few years ago.
Right.
But we aren't plunging into a distressed fire sale environment either. It is a market that rewards calculated strategic moves.
So if you're a seller in this Goldilocks market, the research points to a very clear warning, right? The market is currently punishing what they call aspirational pricing.
Heavily punishing it, yes. The era of just throwing a sky-high asking price onto the property portals just to test the waters and see if a desperate buyer bites, that is definitively over.
Yeah, because with over 38,000 units coming down the pipeline, buyers finally have genuine options for the first time since, what, 2019?
Pretty much.
They just don't have to tolerate unrealistic premiums anymore. The data specifically highlights the generic secondary market condos are highly vulnerable.
Yeah, the older units that lack clear differentiation.
Exactly. Maybe they aren't near an MRT, or they have aging leaseholds. If you hold one of these generic condos in the CCR, for instance, and it's not near a top school, you have to price to sell. The market will simply bypass you for newer inventory.
It's a harsh reality, but it's true.
And what does the landscape look like for buyers? Because it sounds pretty favorable.
For buyers, the good news is that you finally have breathing room. The FOMO, the fear of missing out, is fading.
Nice.
If you are navigating the resale market right now, you actually have genuine negotiation leverage. Sellers are acutely aware of that incoming supply pipeline we just talked about.
So you can actually take a beat.
Right. You can do your due diligence, run the numbers, and comfortably walk away from bad deals.
There is, however, one really critical caveat in the data for a very specific subset of buyers.
Yes, the EC buyers.
Right, those looking at executive condos in the East. This is where the Goldilocks rule really bends a little bit. If you are an eligible buyer targeting an EC in the East Coast or Pasir Ris area, your runway is shockingly short.
Very short.
The supply data shows only 2 ECs are slated for 2026, Revel and Coastal Cabana.
And if we look at the confirmed GLS list, the government hasn't allocated any new confirmed EC sites for the East. That means after Revel and Coastal Cabana, there will likely be 0 new EC launches in that specific corridor before 2027 or 2028.
So if you quantify for subsidized pricing and you absolutely want to stay in the East, you cannot afford to just sit back and wait for the next one.
Because the next one isn't coming for years.
Exactly. That's a micro market where urgency is still a very, very real factor, despite the broader calming trends.
It perfectly highlights why you can't just read a generic headline about the property market cooling down and assume it applies to every single neighborhood and property type. You have to know exactly which lane of the market you are driving in.
So let's synthesize this incredible recalibration. We watched the market go from a total drought in Q1 to a massive 1,548 unit surge in April.
Yeah.
We dissected how the suburban market essentially fractured into 2 speeds. You've got the Tengah mass market efficiency play at $2,111 PSF, and then the Vela Bay premium lifestyle benchmark at a $2,865 PSF.
And we saw how the government countered that $2,865 benchmark by immediately injecting over 1,000 units of supply into BDOC and more into Labrador Park just to anchor those future expectations.
Right. And ultimately, we've arrived at a stabilizing, buyer-friendly Goldilocks market where patience is an asset, but realistic pricing is an absolute requirement if you're selling.
It really is a brilliant chess match between the developers, the buyers, and the policymakers.
It is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's a deeper, somewhat provocative provocative connection buried in the data that I think we really need to examine.
Okay, you know what you're getting at. It relates to the underlying financial engine driving these suburban sales.
Right. We know from the URA and HDB statistics that record-breaking million-dollar HDB resales, we're talking 1,598 units crossing that threshold in 2025 alone, are basically acting as the primary funding mechanism for these expensive new condos.
Yeah, that MOP wave we discussed.
Exactly. A family sells their public flat for $1 million, and they use that massive equity injection to leapfrog into a $2,800 per square foot suburban private property.
It basically functions as a highly efficient, closed-loop system of equity transfer, moving wealth from the public sector directly to the private sector.
But think about the long-term structural implication of that mechanism. If the floor for public housing keeps rising simply to provide the necessary leverage to fund suburban private homes that are pushing $2,800 per square foot, what happens to the next generation?
That is the million-dollar question.
Will the future of basic mass-market private living in Singapore eventually require a multi-generational wealth transfer just to get a foot in the door? I mean, if you don't have parents who can unlock a $1 million public flat to help with your down payment, how does the math ever work for a young couple starting from zero?
It is arguably the most critical question facing the system today. As the price gap between the prime city and the suburbs collapses to just that 10% margin, the absolute wealth gap required simply to enter the private market is widening in ways that might fundamentally alter the social fabric.
It certainly makes you wonder if that tidal wave of 1,548 sales in April represents a sustainable, healthy market, or if it's just the crest of an equity wave that's eventually going to break against the shores of affordability. So keep questioning the numbers, look really closely at the supply pipelines in your specific neighborhood, and remember that the best investment is always an informed one. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.